We've seen that at its simplest, radical theorists argue the governments of capitalist countries pursue policies that further the interests of the capitalist class. Let's take a look at a couple of first world capitalist interventions in the politics of a third world developing country. We'll look at a more contemporary example in a little bit, but our first incident of U.S. foreign intervention occurred during the Cold War. That long period when all of geopolitics was looked at through the prism of an existential conflict between the United States and its NATO allies on the one hand, and the communist countries on the other. It was called a Cold War because despite the fact that some perceived this as a life and death struggle between two different ways of existing, these two nuclear powers generally managed to avoid direct confrontation, although proxy wars did break out. During the Cold War, we viewed pretty much any force to the left of the middle of the Democratic Party as potentially communist, even when these governments were elected through democratic means. We tended to judge their reformism, their socialism, or in some cases, perhaps their communism. We saw them as a threat against the American way of life. As the most powerful, most well-known U.S. Secretary of State of the 20th century, Henry Kissinger, put it, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the voters to be left to decide for themselves." There are a lot of interesting questions that surround this that, if people are interested, we can talk about more. To what degree were American policymakers during this period, to what degree were they really afraid of the communist threat? But for the moment, before we begin to talk about 1954, we should remember that this fear of communism and virulent anti-communism was the context, the backdrop for pretty much all U.S. policy during at least the period 1945 to about 1991, when the Berlin Wall came down and the USSR dissolved. The background to the U.S.-sponsored coup in Guatemala in 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was elected president of Guatemala by a wide margin. Arbenz ran on a platform centering on redistribution of land. Large landholders would have land that they were not using, forcibly purchased by the state, which would then give it to poor peasants. By far the largest landowner in Guatemala was the American company United Fruit. Since much of their land was not being cultivated, they would have lost about 40% of their holdings. They would have been compensated at the value they had declared on their taxes, but they simply did not want to sell. When United Fruit decided they wanted to put an end to the Arbenz administration, they were incredibly well positioned to influence U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower. The influence of one private company on the U.S. government in this situation is hard to believe.
Dangle the string for the puppets to dance when I say, talk when I say, walk when I say.
United Fruit had an in with the Secretary of State, John Dulles. He had represented them on some legal work, and his law firm still represented them. His brother, Alan, was the head of the CIA, which is kind of a surprise in and of itself. In addition, he was on the board of United Fruit. President Dwight Eisenhower's personal secretary happened to be married to United Fruit's head lobbyist. So in this group of people, all of whom had a close connection with United Fruit. When this group began pushing Dwight Eisenhower to intervene, Eisenhower got the message loud and clear. President Eisenhower gave the approval for Dulles' CIA to organize a coup. The operation successfully deposed Arbenz and installed Colonel Armas as president. This was good news for United Fruit, as Armas rolled back all of Arbenz's policies and eliminated the land reform. But it ushered in a fairly terrible period for the people of Guatemala. It was more than 40 years before democracy was reestablished. A series of US-backed dictators imprisoned thousands of Guatemalans. Government death squads killed thousands more. In the 1960s, the Guatemalan military became convinced Mayans, many of whom would have been recipients of redistributed land, became convinced that enough Mayans were against the government that they began a slow and violent campaign of virtual genocide that lasted more than 2 decades. These massacres of poor farming families ultimately sparked a civil war, which led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. Extensive CIA investigations after the elimination of the Arbenz government found absolutely no evidence of the supposed Soviet influence. United Fruit changed its name to Chiquita and is now valued at more than $1 billion. But they didn't change their politically intervening ways. In 2007, they pleaded guilty in a U.S. court for having armed Colombian terrorists. Chiquita paid a large fine, which barely made a dent in their annual profits, but no individual executives were either charged or convicted. Eventually, we, the United States, did apologize for our role in the coup, the ensuing civil war, as well as for intentionally affecting Guatemalans with sexually transmitted diseases. While it is not unusual for corporate America to have connections in government, it's certainly not the case that every big corporation has this many close connections with the capitalist government of their country. Radical theorists argue that even when no such connections are to be found, the capitalist state will still pursue and protect the interests of the capitalist class, even if that means intervening in other countries' democracy. They also claim that the Cold War was just a pretext, that capitalist countries like the United States have continued to intervene to force free trade and force laissez-faire capitalism on third world countries around the world, and that they've continued doing this even in the decades since the USSR fell apart. Are they right? We'll look at a much more contemporary US intervention, and we'll do that in the next video.